All right, hope you stretched your legs. Let's get back into it. So we need to talk about perfectly competitive firms. Perfectly competitive firms is a situation where no firm has the market power, right? There are so many buyers and sellers that not one firm controls everything. So this means that when we think about a Rothschild index, it's something close to zero, right? It's not a highly concentrated industry. That means that there's no concentration whatsoever. Tons of buyers and sellers. So this is an extreme that we're talking about, but that's because if we know the extreme of a perfectly competitive market, and then after this we'll learn the extreme of a monopoly market, then we can kind of figure out everything in between it, right? So we have a Rothschild index of zero. There is no concentration in this industry. We have a Lerner's index of zero. This company has absolutely no control over prices. They have no power, right? A good example about this is like apples at the farmer's market, right? You do not know who every single farmer is, and they don't really each have any power to manipulate the apple prices. One person cannot come to the farmer's market and said, oh, I see bags of apples are going for $5. Mine are going to be $10. They can't do that, right? Doesn't make sense. So no market power, no concentration, markup equal to zero. Markup equal to zero just means that they're going to have to charge what everybody else is charging. Because you know what you do if you go to the farmer's market and there are 25 stands with $5 apples and one stand with $6 apples? You don't go to the stand with $6 apples, right? That markup is not a solution or a strategy that's potentially there because of all the competition. In these perfectly competitive worlds, many buyers, there are so many people coming to these markets and many sellers. There are many people selling the product that not one can control things. Right? Then we have to think that these are identical products, right? So there's no product differentiation when we're talking about a perfectly competitive market. It's not that we have Granny Smith apples and Fiji apples and red apples and blue apples and green apples or whatever other type of apples. It is that they all have an identical product when we're talking about a perfectly competitive market. All of them have the same red apples. They're all about the same quality, right? In this example, and it can be like this for lots of things. Number two pencils. I guarantee that you probably do not know every single pencil manufacturer out there, but you know what a yellow pencil that's a number two pencil looks like, right? They're just identical products, even if 100 or 150 or 200 different firms are making them. Another part about a perfectly competitive market that we have to assume is that there's perfect information on both sides of the market. That means that buyers know exactly how much they value a pencil, and they know what the typical going rate for a pencil is, or an apple. They know exactly the value they get from an apple and how much it should cost. They know that normally when they go to the farmer's market, a bag of apples is $5, that all the stands are selling it for $5, and that $6 would be a bad deal. Likewise, our sellers also have perfect information. They know, hey, all the people who are coming to the farmer's market today, they're willing to pay about $5 and they expect to pay $5. They're aware of this. They won't go and charge $4 because they're like, oh, why would I do that? Everybody here is expecting to pay $5. There's no transaction cost. That means that they're not having to get a government permit to do something. They're not having to pay lots of different prices to sell their apples or sell their wares or sell their pencils or anything else. We're going to assume that there's no real extra cost besides the cost to just produce something and to sell something and to buy something. Like these, there's no transaction costs such as having to pay for a fee for the register. There's no paying an additional fee for so on and so forth. And we also like to think that there's free entry and exit into this market. So free entry and exit means that there's like no government regulatory hurdles for you starting your company. When we were talking about telecom, well, why aren't there more telecommunications companies? Because guess what? You have to make a lot of agreements with a lot of different state agencies. You have to figure out what your state taxes are going to be. You have to talk to many national providers. You have to talk to the government. It's difficult. There's barriers, right? Why can't you just start an airplane company or an airline? Because you have to get permission from the FAA and go through millions and millions of dollars in time and paperwork and everything else. But in our perfectly competitive world, we assume that there's free entry and exit. If you want to grow apples, you can grow apples and you can take them to the farmer's market. There's no real entry barrier stopping you from being able to do that. There's also no exit barrier. There's no one to say, well, you're holding up the airline market, right? You can't leave. Or you're holding up, in our case, the apple market. You cannot stop selling apples. That doesn't exist here. So perfectly competitive markets, this is the most simple version that we can possibly do of an economics model, right? It just means there's no competition. You take what price is in the market, you have perfect information, you can come or you can go, or you can do whatever else you want, and all of us knows what's happening. Everybody's selling an identical product. It is the most simple case of economics, which makes it a great starting place, because this is a very interesting starting point when we're building our cases for what happens when we go beyond this. What happens when we do have a Rothschild index above 0 or a learner's index above 0? What happens when there are markups in the firm or anything else like that? So when we get down to it, we need to think specifically as firms as price takers. So price takers just means that the firms do not control their prices. If you are going to the farmer's market to sell apples and everybody's selling apples for $5, that you are taking that price and you are using that price yourself. You cannot say, okay, well, I'm doing $6. Instead, you are going to have a price equal to the price in the market. In this case, it'd be $5. And that $5 is equal to your marginal revenue. So for perfectly competitive firms, not for all firms, for perfectly competitive firms, price equals marginal revenue. The amount of money I make for every bag of apples is $5. The price is $5, right? In the short run, we might see that I might be profitable or I might lose money. And that happens for all firms. You're going to have some good weeks. You're going to have some bad weeks. In the long run, you may have a counting profit. You might make money on your spreadsheets or in your bank accounts. But when we really think about opportunity costs, when we start adding in the differences in between accounting profit and economic profit, in the long run, there are no profits. There are no economic profits in the long run. So each firm only ends up earning just nominal profit. You get the money in your accounting spreadsheet, but you don't necessarily make economic profit. The reason for this is because you're a price taker and opportunity cost exists, right? There's a better use of your time. There's a better use of your resources, or there may be, right? If there is a better use of your time or resources, you'll just leave the market. If this is the best option, you end up staying in this market. In the long run, everything kind of balances out. Some firms leave. So when there are profits, more firms come in and it's great. And then when the profits drop off and there's losses, firms leave. And then we get this sort of equilibrium balance. Notice that I say equilibrium. That's like the market equilibrium, right? It's when demand equals supply, when the amount of people who want to purchase something at one price equals the amount of people who want to sell something at one price. That sort of equilibrium clearing, getting to that point, is what we say when we say that long run economic profit is really 0. It's the fact that we will operate up until the point where the marginal cost equals the marginal benefit. So these firms are price takers, right? Now, how realistic is this? Because you're like, oh, why am I about to learn this? Well, many businesses are price takers at the end of the day, right? Mostly in agriculture, but we see this in lots of other things. For the number 2 pencils or yo-yos, surprisingly, it turns out there's a lot of competition in yo-yos, and they actually have like a lot of $1 easy yo-yos. Anyways, that's besides the point. I will not go down a yo-yo rant, I promise. Books tend to have very similar pricing strategies when you go to Barnes & Noble. There's lots of things where people might be price takers because it's the price that's expected in the market, or it's the price that you, the people who purchase it from you, expect to pay, and it's what everybody else charges. And rules for firms like these, they're intrinsic. They exist because of the models that we have created. Well, they exist from the backbones that even created those models to begin with. This is a useful benchmark theoretically to, if we understand the absolute perfect competition pace where nobody controls anything and it's just a bunch of stuff being bought and sold and they're all identical. This is a great foundation to start from, but it's not necessarily what happens in the real world. In the real world, we do have product differentiation. We do have outside forces that might happen, like maybe there's some sort of famine, or there might be some sort of disease that takes out the apple orchards or something. We have those shocks in the real world, but we need to start somewhere when we're developing these mathematical models, right? And this perfect competition, when we start looking at this versus monopoly later on, you might start to understand why governments tend to oppose monopolies, because we'll see some of the price effects that happen for essential goods and services under the theoretical and mathematical models that we have for picturing the effects of these businesses, right? And this can kind of illustrate the danger to managers of competitive environments. So there's really, really good benefits to competitive environments, but there's also some bad parts too. You don't have the markups. You can't charge extra for your good or service beyond what it costs you, right? Your marginal revenue is your profit. You can't change the price of your good depending on what you think is best for your company. You're taking what is happening within the market. So assuming our firm is perfectly competitive and no one really has any control and they kind of just go along with it and they sell at what the market has provided. The $5 sack of apples is $5 because everybody's selling it for $5. What does this look like? Well, actually, you know what, let's draw this out first so we can kind of think about each part. What this looks like first and foremost is the supply and demand graph that we've been doing this entire time. We'll actually notice when I show you later that supply and demand graphs are a little bit different outside of perfect competition. Actually, first let's put it up here, perfect competition. So we need to think about what we actually get from our supply and demand graph when we're thinking about our quantity versus our prices. And we know we have our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve, right? At this point, we know that there's some sort of market equilibrium. Well, this market equilibrium we don't get to necessarily overnight, but the market eventually gravitates towards it. We get to a point that if nothing else changes, we have some sort of equilibrium price. It's the price that everybody kind of expects for this good or service. And we have an amount of quantity or an equilibrium quantity, the amount that will be bought and sold within that market. Now, what does this really tell us at the end of the day? Well, this tells us a lot about when it comes to marginal revenue, right? And total revenue. So if we take the supply and demand graph, we think about all the things that are bought and sold in this market, we sell up to Q star. Well, if we think about, let's say, total revenue, so the total amount of money that's going to be collected by firms and the quantity, if everything sells for the exact same price, that total revenue is going to be a linear curve, right? If, for example, the first set of sweater sells for $25 and the second sweater sells for $25, then all of a sudden that company has made $50. The next sweater sells for $25, then we have $75. If the next one sells for $25, then it's $100 revenue. So on and so forth as we have this linear relationship. So we think about this as total revenue. And notice that it's a just flat curve. It doesn't have like lots of curvature to it as it would if we start extrapolating beyond the perfect competitive model. But for right now, let's just assume it's this nice straight relationship where total revenue goes up by the amount of whatever the price is, right? So that means when we think about marginal revenue, which is actually going to be our third one right here, as we're thinking about the quantity that we're selling and the price at which we're selling it for, well, for maybe this first sweater, maybe we sell it for $25. Okay, well, that means for this first sweater, the price is 25. So let's say this is 25, right? Okay, then let's say that when we have sold two sweaters, that if we come up here and draw it out, maybe there's $50 in the total revenue account. Okay, well, that means that we made $25 on that second sweater. Okay, then there's a third sweater. So there's so many sweaters that it's to the point where I am not going to have to barter with someone. I'm not going to say, oh, you bought the first one for 50. I'll sell you the second one for 24. And then I'll sell you this next one for 12, right? If there's so many people buying and selling that the price is just set, the price is always equal to the same thing. It's always the $5 for apples, or in this case, $25 for sweaters. Then that means as we sell this third sweater, we have $75 in total revenue. That means that the marginal revenue from that third one is going to be $25. Notice that this line represents price, but it also represents something very, very special that makes it a mathematically easier model when we're talking about this perfectly competitive framework. And it's the fact that this price right here, this wonderful price that we've come to, this is $25 right here, right? This is actually equal to the marginal revenue, the additional amount that comes into the bank account for each one that is sold. Now, in this, we're not thinking about total cost, right? Because we're going to think about that part later. Right now, we're going to think about this total revenue aspect to it, and that our price is going to be equal to what that marginal revenue is. The marginal revenue is collected together, multiplied by the quantity that we have, equals our total revenue. So this piece right here, this flat line where we have price, that's something that is unique. This marginal revenue curve is unique to the perfectly competitive framework. So here, let me show you that again in slides, because again, my drawing is terrible, so I try to always give you something in slides that go along with it. But as we see that the market has come to some price and quantity agreement, then in the perfectly competitive framework, the price will be equal to whatever that amount is, and our marginal revenue will be equal to that. So this marginal revenue curve will be flat, and our total revenue curve will have a linear upward line. Okay, so the firm needs to make some decisions, right? A perfectly competitive firm is to make maximum economic profit. Now, notice I said there's no economic profit in the long run. If you were thinking about the profit that you can make on apples in your lifetime when there's so many other people making apples, it's not really going to work out the fact that you have economic profit beyond your opportunity cost that you would get in the long run. Because if there were profits to be made, more people would come in. If there were losses to be had, some people would leave. But what about the decision to come into the market or leave the market? Well, the perfectly competitive firm wants to maximize this economic profit in the long run. They want to try to make that money in the short run. Hopefully it's a year where maybe you do make that profit, or maybe there's less competitive, or it's a slight amount of time for profits until the market levels back out. So the firms need to make some very crucial decisions at this point when they're deciding, okay, well, how much am I going to produce? The first one is, how do we produce at the minimum cost? So if I'm selling apples for $5 and everybody else is selling apples for $5, the only way for me to really try to make a profit is to try to make the difference in between that revenue and cost as much as possible, right? I want revenue to be high, but revenue set at whatever the market is, and I want the cost to be low. So you want to produce at the minimum cost possible. You want to make that $5 of apples that you're selling for as little amount of money as you possibly can. Then after that, you have to figure out what quantity to produce. Are you going to produce 10,000 apples, or are you going to produce 20 apples? Are you going to have 1 tree or 30 trees, right? That's a quantity decision that every firm has to make. Then they have to also decide whether to enter or exit a market. If you see profits happening in the apple world, you might decide to become an apple farmer. Or if you see that there are losses in the market, that it's not a good year for apples, you might decide to exit the market. Because remember, we're in a situation where there's free entry and exit from a market. So with all this, when we start thinking about that cost and the difference between cost and revenue, and we're thinking about the quantity, and we're thinking about entry and exit and the quantity that comes with entry and exit, we have to start looking at the firm's output decision. How do they decide how much they're going to produce, right? Well, it turns out that that's going to be a function of the marginal cost and marginal revenue. If you remember from last time what we were talking about, marginal cost can initially go down, after you bought all the equipment. Marginal cost might go down with the second employee you have, the third employee, they're being really, really efficient. And then marginal cost is going to go back up, because by the time you're producing a ton of things, you've had to hire a lot of people. It's very, very costly to produce that next apple relative to what you had already had, right? So let's think about the output decision. Let's actually try to draw this out first. And when we're thinking about this output decision, let's go back to the sort of graphs that we had thought about last time, except this time I'm going to start out by just giving you 2 lines to begin with, because remember last time we had the average fixed cost, average variable cost, average total cost, marginal cost, all in the same graph, and that's going to get confusing if I give you all 4 plus the fact I'm about to add in marginal revenue. So let's at first start with sort of a simpler model, right? And in this one, let's think about the quantity. And hold on, what do I label in the slides? So I want to make sure that I'm staying consistent with that. Okay, I give you marginal revenue. Sure, why not? All right, so this one's going to be equal to marginal revenue or marginal cost. Let's call it marginal revenue at first, because I don't want to confuse anybody. So let's say marginal revenue. Well, we already figured out, right? When we were up here, we saw, okay, well, the really, really cool part about perfectly competitive firms is that everything gets sold at that price. So this marginal revenue curve, notice it's flat. It's a flat line. So that means the amount of money you make from the first sweater is $25. The money you make from the 50th sweater is $25 in this case. Let's say we had $25. And this is our marginal revenue line. Notice that it is flat. That is a function of perfectly competitive firms. Do not, when I give you a monopoly example, say that marginal revenues are typically flat. In monopolies, they are not. And we're going to figure this out. Marginal cost, remember, looks like a check mark. We went over that last class. So marginal cost might be initially a little bit higher. It'll go down as there's some specialization and competition. Then all of a sudden it starts to go up. For marginal cost, it can get real pricey real fast, right? When I start producing 10,000 sweaters or 10,000 apples, like that starts to get really expensive for each additional one that I want. Okay. Well, we have to figure out what sort of quantity are we going to want to produce. If we produce down here, where marginal cost is as low as possible, we do have a difference in between marginal revenue and marginal cost. It might be that, yeah, we make $25 in marginal revenue. And at this case, maybe the marginal cost would be $20. So that means that we're going to make $5 on that sweater. But the thing is, what if we produced one more? Maybe this would cost us $20.50 to produce, but we'd still be making $25 from it. So even though we're not making that full $5, we're still making $4.50. So we would want to increase the amount of production. So we'd want to keep increasing our quantity through this piece, where in this place we have marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. If marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, we increase production. But what if we go all the way over here, right? So let's say that we're about right here. Well, at this point, we see that we have marginal revenue. That's the $25 we're going to make. But once we're producing like thousands of sweaters, it might cost us $100 to make that 10,000 sweater. Like, oof, that's a little too pricey. When we're making $25 for a sweater, we don't want to pay $1,000 to make that next sweater. So in this case, right, when we have marginal cost greater than marginal revenue, we'd want to decrease the amount that we are producing. So we'd want to maybe produce less. Well, the next one, you might be like, oh, okay, well, the marginal cost is a little bit lower. Maybe it costs us only $500 to make that sweater. You're like, $500 to make that sweater. I'm only making $25 from it. I'm not going to do that. And in this case, we continue to reduce the amount that we would make, or the quantity that we would make of a good or service item, right? Until we get to this point right here, this piece where marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. I had someone ask me why I do this in all black, by the way. It's because it's better for colorblind students, and I tend to have a lot of colorblind students. That different colors are very difficult to see. So when I'm drawing, I try to keep it all in one color and black, because it's way easier for my colorblind students. All right. But at this point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, check it out. We have a level of quantity. Let's call this Q star. That's the amount we would choose to produce, because less than that, there's still profit-making opportunities. We still have a point where marginal revenue is above marginal cost, and it makes sense to make one more. If it's well above this and marginal cost is above marginal revenue, like it's too pricey to make that next one. We want to produce the amount that we are making until we get to this point where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We see that in the output decisions that I give you within the slides. Boom. You're wanting to profit maximize, and profit maximizing is at a point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Now, a very important rule to know for perfectly competitive firms. If we have a perfectly competitive firm, let's see, perfectly competitive. Oh, I cannot write to save my life. We produce at this point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Remember, all the way up here, we had one other cool piece. We noticed that marginal revenue is equal to price. That is a function of perfectly competitive firms. So where we're going to produce is we're going to produce at a level where the marginal cost equals marginal revenue equals our price. Remember the rule of transitivity. That means that we're going to produce up until the point where the marginal cost, the cost to produce one more of something, is equal to the price. I will keep producing apples until my cost of that next bushel of apples is $5, because the price is $5. If sweaters are $25, I will keep making sweaters until the marginal cost of producing my next sweater is $25, because that's the price I will get from it. And that is where I stop, right? At that point, I have drained all the profit I possibly could from this situation. And that's kind of neat, because that's the sort of secret for understanding this perfectly competitive framework, right? After that, we got to start thinking about when do we shut down, because this makes sense. That makes sense, but that's hard to do in practice, to figure out exactly what quantity we need or exactly what quantity would be best for the market. So let me first start you out with a question. And this might get you thinking about why we would even care about temporary shutdown decisions. It could be that if we were going to the apple market, that we just had a bad day. Would we stop selling apples? Probably not. Because, I might still make enough to cover labor and I might have a better day tomorrow. It's not like that for every single type of firm. Why? And here's your question. Why do ski lodges close in the summer? Well, let's think about this. Okay, if ski lodges close in the summer, what do I have to pay regardless? I'm always going to have to pay my fixed cost. So I'm paying the rent on that ski lodge no matter what month it is. I'm still going to have to pay the rent for it. During winter, that's no big deal, right? I definitely can make enough to pay my rent in winter, but I can't really make enough to pay my rent in summer. There's also one other piece of the equation. It's the idea of this average variable cost. Average variable cost, that's like the worker's wages. Well, in winter, I can not only make enough money to pay the rent, I can make enough money to pay the worker's wages. And that is awesome. I would want to stay open, right? There might be times where I am not having as good of a time. Maybe I can definitely pay the rent. This is like when we're getting towards the end of the snow season. You're getting into like March. It's about time to start thinking about shutting down. At those points, like we're still able to pay the rent, but I'm having some temporary losses going on. I'm not making enough money to pay all of my workers all of their wages. Well, at that point, I might say, well, it might be time to shut down. It might be time to shut down. Because we need to think about, can we not only pay our total cost, but can we pay the average variable cost? If it becomes too expensive to employ workers, then we have the choice of, do we want to lose out and just have to pay the rent out of pocket, or do we want to lose out and have to pay the rent out of pocket and pay the workers out of pocket? That's a little tough. Okay. So why do ski lodges shut down? Well, in this, we're going to have to think about a loss comparison. We're going to have to start to figure out, where's the point where we're not only like maximizing profit, where's the point where we're minimizing loss? And when is that minimizing loss shutting the doors to the company? Or even if it's just for a little while, right? It's not always ending your company. Sometimes it's just saying, I'm going to be closed during the summer month. Or if you have a pool, I'm going to be closed during the winter months. Okay, so let's think about this in the terms of loss comparison. So it's really great when we have profit months, and those are easy to make decisions on. If you're making profits, you just want to make more profits. But if you're making losses, it's not necessarily the end of the world. You don't burn down your apple orchard if you have one bad day at the farmer's market, right? And you don't sell off your ski lodge or hire a very inefficient person to manage the boiler system. That's a Stephen King reference if anybody's interested. Anyways, so you don't do that if it's something that can still maintain really good profit in other months and you just happen to be having a bad month or two, right? So the firm's losses are going to equal the total fixed cost plus the total variable cost minus total revenue. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. Here, we'll give you an example. So I like the idea of ski lodges. Let's think about ski lodges and let's think about this economic cost piece. So our economic loss, this is going to be equal to that total fixed cost, right? The total amount of rent that you would have to pay, or the amount for this capital input, this total fixed cost plus the total variable cost. So remember that this is the cost part of the equation, right? Cost. Total fixed cost is for the things that we can't really change. You're going to have to pay rent regardless. Variable cost, well, in practice, this can be lots of things. It can be the electricity, it can be the workers, it can be the insurance, but in our models, we're just going to assume that this is employees' wages. So let's say that for our wonderful ski lodge, that we have to pay some amount of rent on the building plus some amount of wages to employees if we have any employees working. All right, so this cost minus the total revenue. So we're going to say total revenue. So this is money in. This difference right here, this is going to be equal to economic loss. If our cost is really, really low, so let's say we pay $1,000 in rent plus $500 of employee wages, that's $1,500 of cost minus, let's say that the total revenue is really, really big. Let's say that we made $5,000. All right, well, then that means we have $1,500 worth of cost minus $5,000 in total revenue. This means our loss is negative 3,500. Yes, we can just say economic profit and have this as a positive number. I don't know why we do not. Please take that up with people on a much higher pay scale than me at Harvard and MIT and all those other places, because they were the ones who decided that we started looking at it this way. And now we have to keep it consistent because a bunch of very, very rich people at very, very rich schools said that we had to. So this is how we're going to learn it. But I too think that we should switch that revenue and cost part. All right, so our economic loss in this case would be negative 3,500. All right, in this case, we're not really having a loss, right? That's no loss. We're having a good time. Things are great. Okay, so in that case, what do we do? Well, if there's no loss, where did my thing go? We would want to stay open. Smiley face. This is good. All right, let's think about it from another situation. Let's say that we have $1,000 in rent plus this $500 to pay employees, and we make only $1,200. Okay. Ooh, that's starting to get a little bit tougher there, right? So in this case, that means that we have $1,500 worth of cost and $1,200 worth of revenue. So in this case, we're making $300 in economic loss. Well, in this case, we're making enough to pay the workers, and we're making enough to put some towards the rent. In this case, we may consider staying open, because this might be like the months where it's like March or it's like September. It's not the best months for the ski lodge, but like if you make enough to pay the workers and put some money towards rent, well, that little bit of loss is way better than just paying the rent with no income. So here, let's put this as just a straight face, right? We're not happy, we're not sad. It's just like, we can't do this long term. All right, let's think about a third situation. Let's say that we're making $1,000 in rent, or we had to pay $1,000 in rent, plus $500 for employees. Okay, and let's say that we make zero, right? No one's coming to the ski lodge in July. That is ridiculous. All right, well, then in this case, 1,500, like that's a lot of money, right? That's a lot of economic loss. At this point, we might consider temporarily shutting down, which I'll tell you, or I'll show you what that means in a minute. Because see, we are sad face here. We're like, ooh, that is $1,500. We're losing. We're not happy about it. So how can we minimize that $1,500 that we're losing? Well, one thing that we can do if we temporarily shut down is we can stop paying employees. If we board up the ski lodge for a bit, yeah, we might have to pay the $1,000 in rent, but we pay zero in the employee costs because we sent all the employees home. We're temporarily closed. In this case, we're still going to make zero in revenue, but our economic loss is 1,000 as opposed to the 1,500 that it would be with employees. So some months it might make sense to take this option, right? It might make sense to temporarily shut down when it's a case where, okay, losing the rent's better than losing both the rent and the amount of money that we would spend on employees. Yeah, so let's go back to what we're thinking about. So when we have this total cost, or actually, no, let's think about the economic loss one other way. When we're thinking about this economic loss and we're thinking about the differences in the cost and the revenue, we can rewrite this one other way. So this economic loss, so this is rewriting the equation we have above. We know that it's this total fixed cost, right? It's the amount of rent that we have to pay regardless, the amount that, or like the rental rate or whatever else for the capital goods that we have. But we can also think about total fixed cost in a different sort of way, right? Total fixed cost is the average not total fixed cost. I'm losing my mind. If we think about the total variable cost, we're looking at this TVC part. All right, if we're looking at this TVC part, what does total variable cost really mean? Well, we can think about that as average variable cost times the amount that we produced, right? So the amount that we produced just divided by the quantity that we're producing. So let's say that this total fixed cost plus, let's have this as the average variable cost times the quantity. So that's going to be a cost for us. The cost for each additional one that we are, each additional thing that we are producing times the average variable cost, the average variable cost per thing that we produce. Same thing as total variable cost, just rewriting it. Okay, well, maybe we can also think about total revenue in a different way. Total revenue in this perfectly competitive firm, this piece right here, this TR, what this really is, it's just price times quantity. It's the amount of money and that comes into the bank account is just the price of everything times the amount that we sell. So in this case, we might have a situation where we can rewrite the equation like this, where we have rent plus cost of producing on average, right, minus the price for each one times the number we produce. So thinking about total fixed cost plus the average variable cost minus the price, because that amount of average variable cost minus price, this represents what our total variable cost minus total revenue is going to be times quantity. And that is cool. That's super neat, because then this tells us where our shutdown point is. And our shutdown point is where this average variable cost, right, becomes more expensive than price. If the price is let's say the average variable cost is, I don't know, 50, and the price is 38. Well, then the average variable cost is too high. This number is not conducive to us. What if it's the average variable cost is 12, but the price is 50? Well, if something costs $50, it costs me $12 to pay my employees. That is $38 I can put towards rent, right? So even if I have a loss in the short run, in this case, I might decide to stay open. That's that middle case. Well, temporarily shut down is where we might say, you know, it's getting too pricey for me. I would rather just have to eat the rent as opposed to having to, oh gosh, why did it skip so far ahead? As opposed to losing both the rent and wages. Okay, so let's think about this in another way. So if the firm shuts down, if they do shut down, then the quantity is equal to 0. In that case, we don't end up producing anything. If the quantity is equal to 0. But if the quantity is equal to 0, that means we also don't have average variable cost if we send our employees home. So the firm will still have to pay that rent. It'll have to pay the total fixed cost. But sometimes total fixed cost is the way that we can minimize the economic loss. Isn't that kind of cool? I love this. And like, the only problem of not having this in a classroom is I cannot see everyone's face as they go, oh, because they get it. And that's one of my favorite parts. It's one of my favorite parts. So if you ever get to come to one of my classrooms, please come visit, because it's lots of fun, because I like to see this like, light bulb has turned on moment for people. All right. So the economic loss is the largest the firm must bear when we're at the point where they just pay the rent. If they have decided to close their doors and just pay the rent, that's the largest economic loss that they can have, right? Oops. So then we have to think about the shutdown point. Where is the point where they decide, this may not work. This may not be a good idea anymore. Well, a firm's shutdown point is the price and quantity. So the price of a good times the quantity that we're getting from it, at which we're indifferent between producing the profit maximizing quantity and shutting down. That's the idea, that if I make just enough money to pay my employees and I have nothing left over to put towards the rent, at that point I might decide to shut down. If I make, it's really easy if I make less than that. If I don't make enough to pay my employees, I'll just close the doors and just pay the rent, right? Or lose the rent. If I make way more than I need to pay my employees and I can pay the rent, I'll stay open. But if I'm getting to the point where I can And that goes down, right? Because we're going to have some time where you don't close your business forever just because one day you can pay your employees, but you can't pay all the rent. You don't permanently close your business over that. The point where we decide to shut down is where you make enough money to pay the wages. You make enough money to pay your variable cost. And that's it. If I have just enough to pay employees, then what's the point, right? I'd rather have a quantity of 0, just lose the rent, because I'd just lose the rent either way. It's a sad point, but it's a point that we need to know, especially as you're going into your own businesses, or you're deciding on new locations, or you're deciding, unfortunately, sometimes when you have to close the ski lodge for the winter, or when you have to close the ski lodge forever, right? The shutdown point is the minimum average variable cost. So remember that the marginal cost, the check mark shaped piece, goes through the minimum of the average variable cost and the minimum of the average total cost. It crosses at the bottom of those curves. The shutdown point is just at this minimum of average variable cost, where I can kind of pay the employees the minimum amount. Like if I can just pay the employees and nothing else, like that's the shutdown point. Okay. So in a graph, this is what it would look like. Remember that we have the average total cost, the average variable cost, the marginal cost, and the marginal revenue. You know what? Actually, let's start drawing this out. Let's look at this a little bit differently. So let's think about, oops, where did I, there's my cursor. Let's draw out what each of these are, because if I just show you something with 4+ curves, it gets a little confusing. So let's think about our ski lodge. Actually, let's do this 3 different ways. On each of these, let's have the price. Let's have the quantity. And in this case, we know, because it is a perfectly competitive firm, that we're going to have some sort of flat marginal revenue curve, and that this one's going to be equal to our price. So let's say that the price of a ski lift ticket is $50, right? Okay, well, we're going to have a couple other pieces here. First, we're going to have that marginal cost swoop. Okay, so we know marginal cost is initially it's a little bit more productive, and then it gets very expensive very, very quickly. So sometimes we might make a profit. That might be in the case where we have something like this, where this is our average total cost. Maybe this is our average variable cost. So our total revenue is going to be equal to maybe right here, right? This is a profit. This is good. Notice that the amount of money that we're making is going to be higher than that total cost. That means that we make some sort of profit. That's awesome. That's awesome. We like when we make profit, but it doesn't always necessarily look like that, right? The average total cost could be higher or lower than this marginal revenue. So in this case, we're good to go. Smiley face. We're making some sort of profit. But in this other case, let's have it the same way. We have our price, we have our quantity, we're going to have our flat marginal revenue curve, we're going to have our marginal revenue, our check mark marginal cost. But what if maybe we just meet that average variable cost, and our marginal revenue doesn't even touch our average total cost? So not only are we not making that amount where we can pay both the rent and our workers, we're barely making this point where we can pay the workers. Well, in that case, our losses look like this. So it's going to be this rectangle. Just the difference in between where our marginal revenue is and that average total cost. This block right here is loss. And this is a part of loss where we have decided to shut down. This is our shutdown point. Shutdown points are right here. If our average variable cost is just at or above marginal revenue, we're going to decide to shut down. If over here, our average variable cost is below marginal revenue, all right, we're making enough to pay the workers. If our average total cost is below marginal revenue, this piece right here where it crosses marginal cost, that's great. That means we're making like legitimate actual profit. So sometimes we have profit and sometimes we have loss. Let's give this one a sad face. No bueno, no good. We don't like that, right? We might decide to shut down in those points. So we have this shutdown point that happens, and that's when the amount of losses become enough that it just makes sense to pay for our total fixed cost and nothing else. right? So I don't know why they did it twice. Let's think about an example. So maybe in this example, let's think about the components of what it would be like to have a perfectly competitive firm and what it would mean for things such as optimal price, optimal output, max profits. We can put everything into the same language so we can kind of understand what's going on. Let's say that in this case, and you know what, actually, let me just draw the stuff on another slide. We're going to look at the price, which is $100, and the marginal cost, which is 5Q. Marginal cost is just something times the amount of quantity that we're producing. So let's write that down. And you can follow along on the slides if you want, but I think it might help to have it here. Let's say that we are given some information. And in this information, we're given that we have a good which costs $100 and that the marginal cost of this good is equal to 5Q. Because it's just marginal cost is pretty much always something times quantity, unless we had curvature to it, in which we'd have things that it'd be like this, 5Q minus Q squared minus, I'm not going to do that to you, right? That's a little bit beyond what this course is. That's what I give to my, econ specific students. So let's say marginal cost equals 5Q. Well, the first thing that we need to know is the optimal price. Basically that P star. What would P star be? So remember that P star is when we have our price, our quantity, our downward sloping demand curve, our upward sloping supply curve. There's some point right here where we have P star and Q star, the equilibrium amount of price and the equilibrium amount of quantity. Well, we know of a perfectly competitive firm that all prices are the exact same, right? We operate at a point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost equals price. That's a function of perfectly competitive firms. So we know if the price that we have in the market is $100, that's going to be the optimal price. That optimal price is just the $100. All right, now we need to think about Q star, right? So let's think about this optimal quality, the optimal quantity. All right, well, what do we do next if we really want to know what the marginal revenue and marginal cost means for optimal quantity? Well, first we need to think about one piece of this. So in the first one we thought, okay, well, we know we have the price, that's the optimal price because it's just a function of it. For optimal output, what do we know about output? Well, we know how much money we make off of something, right? And we know that this marginal revenue is equal to price. Okay, and we know that marginal revenue equal to price is equal to $100. So marginal revenue equal to price, $100. What else do we know? Well, we know that marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Well, then that means we have the information that we need to be able to solve this. This marginal revenue, we know $100 because that's what our price is equal to. Marginal cost is one of the two things we're given. Remember that we have $100 for the price and we have 5Q for the marginal cost. So this marginal cost is 5Q. Okay, well, that means that marginal cost equal to marginal revenue is just 5Q is equal to 100. That means that the Q that we would have if we divide 100 by 5, the optimal quantity for us to produce is going to be 20. So we know that P star is equal to 100. Q star in this case is equal to 20. So we're going to produce 20 little doodads for $100. That's kind of cool. Okay, if we know that that's the optimal price and that's the optimal quantity, then what would we do to maximize profits? So let's say that we want to maximize profits. How much profits would we get in this case? If you've been paying attention to me and you know all about, the functions of perfectly competitive firms in the long run, you probably already know the answer to this, but let's think about it anyways. So in our maximum profit, when thinking about profit, we know that we have this total revenue. So profit, remember, we show by like a pi symbol. So profit equals total revenue minus total cost. Okay, well, that makes sense. It's just the difference between money in minus the cost to make it. Well, what is total revenue? Total revenue is the price times the quantity. It's how much we sold and at what price. That'll give us our total revenue. Our total cost is just the marginal cost, right? How much it takes to produce the next one of something times the quantity. All right. So now we know what our total revenue is and our total cost is. So let's start plugging things in and think about this profit. Well, this profit is equal to, our P star times Q, so 100 times 20, that's going to be the total revenue piece, minus, we know our marginal cost is 5Q. Well, 5Q, we already know what Q is, that's 20. So that's going to be 5 times 20 times, what is this again? Another 20, because this Q right here is equal to 20, and this right here is equal to 5Q. 20, 5Q. All right, let's multiply this out. 1,000 times, or 100 times 20, that equals what, 2,000 for our total revenue. Cool. Minus, and let's think about our total cost. 5 times 20, that's 100. 100 times 20, that's 2,000. Notice that our profit is 2,000 minus 2,000. That means it's 0. So what is our maximum profit? It's 0. That should make sense. If you got that number, hey, you're correct. This is a perfectly competitive firm. So remember, I already told you there's no economic profits in the long run. If this comes out to 0, we see we have a profit of 0, we know that we're in the perfectly competitive firm. We know what the optimal price is, we know what the optimal quantity is, and we know that we're not going to receive economic profit in the long run. And that is just neat. All right. So that's kind of a way, just an example to think about what these prices and costs are going to look like. Okay, so let's think about profit and losses in the short run. Notice that I gave you a 0 for profit there, because in the long run, there's not economic profit. Maximum profit is not always going to be a positive economic profit. Maximum profit might be that on your accounting spreadsheet, it says that there is money in your bank account. That is why you go into business. That's why you operate in a particular space. But when we think about economic profit, when we include in that opportunity cost, when we think about the next best uses of your land, and the next best uses of your time, and the next best uses of your labor, and the next best uses of your capital, when we take all that into consideration, your economic profit will be 0 in the long run. Now, in the short run, you might think like, okay, well, in the short run, there might be opportunities. It might be that like some firms closed a little bit prematurely, or maybe apples took off and everybody wants to buy them. There might be profit-making opportunities in the short run. You might have a little bit of profit. But remember that there's free entry and exit. If you have a little bit of profit, well, 3 more companies can show up. And if you're spreading that profit over 3 companies, it starts to go down, get closer to 0, right? And more companies will come until there's no more profit to be made, and economic profit equals 0. The next part would be, what if there's a loss? Well, if it's a really, really bad year for apples and everybody's struggling, some companies are going to close. There's free entry and exit. Well, that means that there's less loss for everybody, right? If there's less competition and there's less things being sold, that means more gets sold by the remaining people. Their loss reduces, gets closer to 0. So whether you have profits or losses in the short run, it's all going to equal out. So in the long run, that there's not an economic profit opportunity to be made, right? So in the long run, what we eventually get to is, remember, in the short run, we have what I showed you here. Notice that your average total cost, average variable cost, they might be below marginal revenue. Or over here, your average variable cost, your average total cost might be above marginal revenue. But in the long run, when we think about all the firms that have come in and all the firms that leave, eventually we get to the point where we have a long run average cost curve, right? Long run average cost curve just means the average total cost in the long run, when we have time to adjust, when we have time to make decisions, right? All of these will eventually get to the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost equals average total cost equals long run average total cost. Essentially, that just means that the profit will be 0, because everything will start to intersect at the same point. Because if they didn't and there were profits, more places would come in. And if they didn't and there were losses, more people would leave, right? So for the summary of perfect competition, short run profits cause entry. Short run profits make people come into the market. Short run losses cause exit. In the short run, people will leave if there are losses. When entry goes up, market supply goes up, market prices go down, quantity goes up. What that basically boils down to is you get to a new equilibrium where there's still no profits. Demand shift inwards, production goes down, firm reduces output, maximize profit, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't really matter. It's all what I boiled down to is long run economic profit is 0, because if there's profit making opportunities, places come in. If there are economic losses happening, people leave, until eventually we get to this point where we are at this equilibrium where there's no long run economic profit. Super cool, right? That's just super neat. Now, perfect competition is the simplest version. What I just showed you is the absolute easiest way that we can think about economics. And it's the idea that all the products are the same. And there are so many buyers and sellers that none of them have any market power. And none of them have any ability to, there's no concentration in the market. None of them have ability to mark up prices. There is no markup of prices in this case, but that's obviously an extreme and not necessarily what we might see happening in the actual market. So from there, we're going to go to the other extreme so that after that, we can talk about what's in between it. And the other extreme is going to be the idea of monopoly. What happens when there's only one firm? They're not a price taker anymore. They don't take the $5 price everybody else has for their bushel of apples. This can be the idea of like Spectrum's the only place that really offers a decent internet in Edwardsville. That's the idea that they are a price maker. If they don't really have competition, they can make the prices that they have. And with that, this seems like another good stopping point. So I will break this into 2 videos, or I guess 3 now, and go over monopoly in the next one. See you soon.